Hey there, and welcome to Create With. We've got a very special guest today who we're going to talk to a little bit about security in Bubble in particular, and the main things to look out for when building your apps to keep them secure. So we've got George Collier here, who is the founder of Not Quite Unicorns, a gold tier Bubble agency and all-round legend when it comes to privacy and security with Bubble. Massive on the forum and are now on X as well, posting all the time about this kind of stuff. So we thought it'd be a great chance to sit down and have a quick chat about security in Bubble. But yeah, hi George.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Let's crack on.
Yeah. So I thought we could kind of jump through the most common things that you kind of see, people kind of forgetting to set up or that can sometimes make mistakes with setting up in Bubble security. But I know you've also got a tool which is amazing that I've been trying out lately that detects a lot of this stuff. But a lot of it is stuff that a lot of people might not have thought of, like privacy rules, for example, and some of the things that you can kind of accidentally not get set up right there.
Yeah, so there's a lot of kind of pillars to bubble security, and one of those is what data should people have access to? A bit later, we can talk about kind of what can they do with that data. But the biggest thing that you can do to protect in terms of what people can access is add privacy rules. Privacy rules, and without any exception, are the only thing that restricts data access in your Bubble app, or more accurately, they permit data access. When you use privacy rules, you're not banning certain users from having access to certain data. Instead, you're granting it. So you're saying, if this invoice is the current user's invoice, then we can show it to them, rather than the vice versa kind of way, where if it's not their invoice, we block it. There's a general misconception that users can only see what you put on your page. So if you have a repeating group and you restrict that with search constraints, for example, then your data is protected. But actually, that's not the case, because it's possible to directly query that, directly query your own Bubble database without kind of adding anything to the page. So even if you've got a blank page, a user with a bit of technical knowledge can get any data that they have access to in your Bubble app. And more than just having access to other people's data, it could allow them to access internal data on themselves that you don't want them to have access to. So if you have internal support tickets, for example, and you can see private notes that your team is chatting about, if your privacy rules permit the user to access that, then they're going to be able to see them. So privacy rules really are the only way to protect your app. Flusk has a privacy rules checker, which you can run. You don't need an account or anything, but it will give you a glance of what kind of data access is public. NQU Secure has a data explorer, so you can actually run as any user type and see all of the data that they can access in a nice table, which is a really easy way to kind of view all of that at a glance. And then if you want to set it up directly in Bubble, the best way that you can test those privacy rules is to just set up a repeating group for every data type in your app and just display an unconstrained do a search and see what kind of data is returned, because that will show exactly what a technical user could access if they really wanted to.
That makes total sense. And I guess when you're setting up your privacy rules, are there some kind of gotchas and things to bear in mind when setting them up? As like, for example, if you're maybe trying to, like in your example there, just give certain users access to certain invoices, is there a best practice way of doing that to make sure that only logged in users can see it and only users who've supposed to be able to see it can see it? Is there any kind of best tips there?
Yeah, so you have to kind of think about every edge case that could happen. So if we take the kind of common scenario where perhaps which we have a multi-tenant app and users belong to a company and companies have projects, we might have a privacy rule that's this project's company is current user's company. But that will create an issue for us if later on down the road we delete the company and the project remains in the database. Because when you delete something in Bubble, any references to it become empty. So the project's company would be empty. And then for a logged out user, their company is also empty because we haven't set it. They're not logged in. We don't know who they are, which would mean that the current user's company is empty. And so is the project's company, which would mean that they have access to that data. So there are two main ways that you can kind of combat that. First is by adding a current user's logged in condition to the privacy rules, but personally I prefer to do is not empty. So our full privacy rule would kind of look like this project's company is current user's company, and current user's company is not empty. And that kind of handles that edge case, and also means that it's easy to kind of develop your app in the future, because you may want to kind of permit some things for logged out users in the future.
Yeah, that's definitely one that I've seen pop up quite a bit. Is that remembering to put onto the end and that the thing exists?
Yeah, if you check the privacy rules of your app using any of the tools that are available, and you see a bunch of data, and you're like, I have privacy rules though, then it's probably that. It's probably data where something associated with it has been deleted, and now it's public.
And that's probably one of the first things I would say is if you want to go and try these tools to check out your app, I highly recommend it, because even if you think you've got privacy rules set up, it really is worth rerunning and just double checking that everything is set up in there. And in terms of like at which point do you build out privacy rules? Now I know a lot of people are very tempted when they start building with Bubble to maybe put off setting up privacy rules because it can make testing difficult, and it's just easier not to do it. But when would you recommend people actually get their privacy rules set up when they're building a new app?
You should set up the privacy rules straight after creating a data type. If you think testing with privacy rules at the start is hard, then try revisiting your app when things start breaking out of nowhere, once you've later added privacy rules, and trying to track that down. It's a huge pain. It's much better to do it at the start. And actually, once you have a grasp on how privacy rules actually work, they're actually not that straightforward. And any issues related to privacy rules aren't actually that common if you know your app inside and out.
And are there any tips you'd use for like debugging privacy rules issues? Like maybe when you're testing your app's front end, I think there are some things you can see in the debugger, aren't there, that kind of can give you some clues as like, why is this thing not appearing in this repeating group? And sometimes you can get some clues, can't you?
So the debugger will show fields that aren't being shown because of privacy rules, but actually Bubble's ability to debug privacy rules for users without external tools isn't actually that great. So I would suggest kind of using one of those internal tools, or having kind of the test page in your Bubble app set up where you have the repeating group for every kind of data type, and can view all of the data that's returned for the user that's there.
Makes sense. And in terms of backend workflows and privacy rules, I guess a lot of people will have seen that option to like bypass privacy rules when running a backend workflow. What are the kind of use cases when you would use that, or is there any particular circumstances that people should or shouldn't use that?
Until a few weeks ago, you would use that if you wanted your backend to be called from an external API, because even when you used an admin token, it wouldn't bypass the privacy rules. It used to a long time ago, but then it kind of stopped. But if that's what you would use it for, so for example, if you were getting a webhook from Stripe, you would want to be able to bypass privacy rules so you can update the user subscription. Now the admin token bypasses privacy rules if you're on the latest Bubble version, so that's not necessary anymore. Avoid enabling that option if you can, because it will mean that your data is more protected, because when you schedule a workflow, that means that you're calling it as the current user. So any actions within that workflow and any workflows scheduled by that workflow to infinity, they will be attached to the current user and will respect the current user's privacy rules.
Makes sense. And are there any just like kind of things to remember when setting up new back-end API workflows, and to try and keep them secure, like making sure that they're not exposed as being public if they don't need to be, and things like that?
Yeah, so exposed backend workflows, exposed as public backend workflows are the second biggest issue that I see in apps that we audit. The first issue is privacy rules, but after that, it's backend workflows that are public. And the issue there is that people assume that when it's public and it requires authentication, it's secure. So you'll all be familiar with kind of the checkbox that says this workflow can run without authentication. And you create your workflow, you make it public because that's the default, and then it's fine because it's authenticated. But actually, no, that's not quite right. There's a difference between authentication and authorization. When we are checking that checkbox or leaving it unchecked, we're saying the workflow requires authentication. And all authentication is identifying myself. All I need to do is show who I am calling that workflow. It doesn't mean that I have permission to run it. So if you have a public backend workflow that does something like delete an app from your database, and it requires authentication, if my privacy rules permit me to access that app in the database, I can still call that workflow. I can call it outside of Bubble just using Postman or another debugging tool. And I'll be able to do that because we have authenticated ourselves as far as Bubble is concerned. It knows who we are. It's just not checking that we're authorized. So the way that you combat that is first by making it not public. That's the easiest way. And then second, for any public backend workflows, it's very, very wise to have a condition on the workflow itself that checks the current user's permissions, or checks, for example, that you haven't already processed this app. There's lots of ways you can approach that.
Makes sense to have a kind of a fail safe there. And do you recommend people have the data API turned on or off as well? That might be a bit of an obvious question, but I know a lot of people aren't 100% sure about what it is and what it does and why you might want to have it off.
I would recommend keeping the data API off unless you explicitly know that you need to use it. The data API provides an easy way for anyone to access data that they have access to. So they don't have to use kind of the thing that a technical user would use to query the database directly. Instead, they can just go to a link in your app and they can view all of the data that they have access to. So if your privacy rules aren't up to scratch, then that means that data will be very accessible. Of course, if your privacy rules are perfect, then that data API isn't going to expose any data that they don't have access to, but it just makes it a bit easier to find and means that if you do make mistakes, it will be more obvious. And we want to make sure that the app is secure, but also protect ourselves because no one's perfect, and make sure that if we do make mistakes, they're harder to find.
Makes sense. It's just another layer of security. If you don't explicitly need it, keep it turned off, and it's just another kind of protection. Another thing that people sometimes wonder about is how to manage files that are uploaded to Bubble, and how to make sure that they're protected and not openly accessible on the internet. And it's not always immediately obvious how to do that. Sometimes it can be tempting to just upload a file, but I think there are some things that you have to kind of consider there, aren't there?
Yeah, so when you upload a file through a file uploader element, you have the option to make that file private. People don't really know what that means often, but it means you can attach it to a thing in your database of any data type. And what you're able to do is basically say, if I can view this thing, then I can also view that file. And that's what the view attach files option is for in privacy rules. So if you make a file not private when it's uploaded, you leave that checkbox unchecked, it will be publicly accessible. So anyone with the link to that file will be able to view it, which of course is bad. And in combination with bad privacy rules, that would make it very, very easy to view files that they shouldn't have access to. The other thing is that you can't trust that they won't be able to find the link to your file. Just because there's no straightforward way to list all of the files in a Bubble app doesn't mean that it's safe. The other challenge that people have with files is that from the back end, it's hard to upload files in general and also privately. The way you have to do it is use Bubble's kind of hidden file upload endpoint, and then you can attach the thing to make it private. You can attach it there, but it's not very straightforward. I'd recommend reading through the forum on how to approach that. But if you're uploading files from a workflow in the front end, make sure you check the make this thing private, make this file private checkbox in the file uploader.
That's a really good tip, and I think we'll put a link to that to a forum post on that topic underneath about uploading files from the back end, because I think that's probably something that a lot of people come across, and yeah, you want to make sure you get that right. Another area in Bubble that sometimes people can make security like setting not great is in the API connector. And particularly when dealing with tokens in there, so making things private or having stuff in there that you were maybe testing with. Is there any kind of gotchas when working with the API connector you'd recommend people keep an eye on?
There's a couple of things there. Firstly, anything that's not explicitly checked as private in an API call is public. And I mean that everything that you see in the API connector, only if it's checked as private will it be protected from the user. Otherwise, it's published in your app's source code. The other thing that people don't think about is when you initialize the API call, the response data is saved. So if you initialize it with real customer data, that response data will be saved into your app's source code. And you need to go through and manually remove all of that data when you click manually enter API response, to be able to protect that. NQU Secure has a tool that will do it all for you in bulk for your API calls, which is pretty handy, but otherwise you need to go through one by one to protect all of that, or make sure that you're only calling test data. The other thing is I sometimes see people appending API tokens in URLs. Those are also public because, as I said before, if it's not explicitly marked as private, it is public. So the best way that you can set up your API connector is to make URLs private where possible, make parameters private, and just keep in mind that anything that isn't private can be seen and will give information about how it's used.
Amazing. That's definitely one to keep an eye on. Well, I think that's such a good kind of good 15-minute kind of mini. I think those are the top things that certainly I've seen coming up a lot recently. So that's really great of you to go through those with us, George. And then I think like we said, if people are at all unsure about any of this, to try the tools that are out there. So Flusk, NQU Secure, and really give it a go. I think it's almost becoming a must when working on any professional bubble project to run those tools through it and double check everything with privacy rules, API connector, just to make sure there's nothing misconfigured there. So any other kind of final thoughts on security that you could think of? But I think that's overall a pretty good list.
Yeah, I'd say it's kind of just a ticking time bomb. It's easy to hide and think that, people won't find out, right? But Bubble is growing, as always. And if you look at things like WordPress, if you have a WordPress site, you'll notice a bunch of people visiting random pages, trying to log into the admin panel. Because just like WordPress, all Bubble sites operate the same and use the same code, which means the same exploits can be used on all Bubble apps, which means even if you're not specifically targeted, anyone that wants to find trouble can do that just by going through any Bubble app that they can find. And they can do that all automatically without much manual effort. And that's how tools like Flusk and NQ Secure are able to exist, by taking advantage of that to show you what hackers could be able to do. If you have any questions about security, the forum is a great place to go, and the documentation has some good resources as well there. But it's not as scary as you think, and it's not as hard to set up as you think. Generally, it's kind of 20% of issues that cause 80% of problems. So by locking those down, then you can protect yourself and your app.
Yeah, and where can people kind of find more about you or online if they want to follow you and learn more about security and Bubble and your agency?
Yeah, I'm most active on the forum. You'll be able to find me without much effort there. I seem to be everywhere there these days, and also on X now at George_NQU. And then you can check out our website if you're interested in us. If you're an experienced developer, we're taking applications there because we're constantly looking to grow. But yeah, feel free to check it out. We do app audits as well, manual audits as well as the automatic ones. So if you're looking for an external kind of POV on your app, then it's a great place to start.
100%. Well, thanks so much for joining us for that quick kind of rundown today, George. That was awesome. And I think George is also going to be joining us at the Create With conference in May. So if you haven't got your ticket yet, check out createwith.com and come along. And you might get to meet George as well. So yeah, thank you so much for that, George. And definitely check George out on the forum and on X. His posts are awesome. You can tips like we've been talking about today all the time. So thanks again, George. That was really great.
Fantastic.
Great. Thanks, Ed. Bye.